Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kalena Gates, and I am an adult public services librarian at the wonderful Detroit Public Library. And I would like to thank you all for attending this evening's presentation titled My Great Great Grandfather, one of the first African Americans to attend the West Point. Now I am going to give you guys an intro about our presenter. Professor Peter Boykin is a native of Detroit. He attended Zoo Elementary School and Cass Technical High School. In 1998, he received his Bachelor of Arts in History from Hampton University in Hampton, Virginia, Master of Arts in Teaching with an emphasis in secondary education from Howard University in 2001, and a Master of Arts in Public Relations in 2009 from Michigan State University. He began his teaching career 22 years ago, subbing in the Montgomery County, Maryland, and Fairfax County Public Schools. Then he went on to teach at Woodbridge High School in 2001 to 2003, instructing students in 9th grade World History and 10th grade Geography. Since January 2004, Professor Boykin has been teaching at Wayne County Community District and has taught American history, world history, and United States history. In addition to his teaching duties, he is a member of the Association for the Study of Life and African American History, Detroit Hampton Alumni, American Federation of Teachers Local 2000, Bethel AME Church Detroit, and Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. Lastly, he is married to Mrs. Sheila Scott Boykin. Without further ado, I now present our speaker for the evening, Professor Peter Boykin.
Kudos to the Detroit Public Library. So this evening, I'm going to present to you an individual with whom some of you are familiar with and with whom many of you are not familiar with, and that is my great-great-grandfather, Johnson Chestnut Whittaker. So I will now start sharing with my slides. Okay, so we're discussing Johnson Chestnut Whittaker. Next slide. He was born on the Mulberry Plantation, Camden, South Carolina, in 1858 on August 23rd, ironically the day after my birthday. And for those of you who are not familiar with geography in South Carolina, Camden is located east of Columbia, which is the capital of South Carolina. My great-great-grandfather became free at the age of 8. He completed his high school and post-secondary education at the University of South Carolina. During Reconstruction, African Americans were allowed to attend the university, and he was a benefactor of that. In the fall of 1876, at age 18, he entered West Point, United States Military Academy. There were several other African Americans at West Point, and they unfortunately did not graduate. But my great-great-grandfather did have the experience to room with Henry O. Flipper, who became the first African American cadet to graduate from West Point. So Flipper was a senior when my great-great-grandfather came in, and after Flipper left, Johnson Whittaker was the lone African American cadet. Next slide. As you can imagine, the climate at West Point was very excruciating for my great-great-grandfather. The white cadets basically saw him as a non-factor. They didn't acknowledge him with orders. He was intimidated. Even in the gym, there was an incident where he tried not to hit a high-ranking officer for fear of being expelled, but they were trying to antagonize him. He received death threats. There were numerous threats that said, "Cadet Whittaker, better keep awake." And so his dream of graduating from West Point in May of 1880 was curtailed a month before, on April 6th. So for those of you who are in the military or familiar with the rituals of the military or armed forces, they play the bugle in the morning, which is called reveille. So on that morning, April 6, 1880, all the cadets were in formation except for my great-great-grandfather. So the higher-ranking West Point students went over to his dorm. When they came to his dorm, they found him tied with his hands behind his head on the floor next to the bedpost, and his right earlobe was cut and was bleeding profusely, and they found pieces of glass that was like a handheld mirror. So the officials at West Point had concocted the notion that he was trying to commit suicide in order to fail an oral philosophy exam, which was required for graduation. And basically, the court martial revealed a lot of overt racism. The cadets really did not, the white cadets, of course, did not really testify in his favor. And they even brought in psychologists and sociologists. And one sociologist and psychologist said that Cadet Whittaker was born to obey far more than to command, basically insinuating that African Americans were docile and they did not have the intellect to be on par with white cadets. So the court martial was moved to New York City and commenced the next year. Next slide, please. So his defense was from two lawyers. The first gentleman on the top was Daniel Chamberlain, former governor of South Carolina. And below was Richard Greener, the first African American to graduate from Harvard undergrad, and also he was the dean of Howard Law School at the time. So the court martial pretty much lasted for about a year. He was found guilty and faced a sentence of a year in a federal prison labor camp. In 1882, Richard Greener and lawyer Martin I. Townsend argued in a court of inquiry to have the conviction overturned. Secretary of War Robert Todd Lincoln found the court martial invalid. President Chester Arthur concurred with Lincoln and pardoned Johnson Whittaker. So my great-great-grandfather returned home to South Carolina and taught high school in Sumter, Charleston, and Orangeburg. And the high school in Orangeburg for African Americans was on the campus of what we know today as South Carolina State University, and also would become the principal. So after Reconstruction, African Americans who wanted a K-12 public education in the South had to get them on the campuses of HBCUs, since there were not a lot of integrated public schools for African Americans. Johnson Whittaker went back to school and got a law degree from Claflin University, which is a private HBCU across the street from South Carolina State. He practiced law in Sumter and Charleston. He would get married to Paige Harrison Whittaker, my great-great-grandmother, and had two sons, Johnson Jr. and Miller Whittaker. And then later on, he would move to Oklahoma City, where he would become principal of Frederick Douglass High School, which is all African-American high school in Oklahoma City. And a little addendum to that, one of his students at Frederick Douglass High School was Ralph Ellison, the African-American writer who was born in Oklahoma City. So when he moved to Oklahoma, he faced racism one more time. He moved there in the early 1900s, and by 1920, around the time when his two sons came back from World War I, they were both officers, commissioned officers in France, and they told him, this has been passed down in the family. He said, Dad, they cheated you out of your commission, but here are our two commissions. And his two sons, unfortunately, had to fight another battle because, they were in an all-white neighborhood, and they were antagonized and sent my great-great-grandmother away to stay with friends. So this garnered the attention of a white newspaper reporter, and my great-great-grandfather told him about the trials and tribulations he suffered at West Point, and he put a headline, and it was entitled, Negroes Have Arsonists. We saw that the attacks stopped. Next slide, please. So my great-great-grandfather did go back to South Carolina, which is where he is buried at the Whittaker family plot, and he died in 1931. He did go around the country to speak somewhat about the incident at West Point, but not in great detail. So the story doesn't end with his death, but it continues. So some 41 years later, historian Dr. John Marszalek, who had written books on General Sherman and the Civil War, and at this time, he was teaching at a small private college in Erie, Pennsylvania. He was at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and he stumbled upon the 10,000 to 12,000 page transcript of my great-great-grandfather's court-martial. Dr. Marszalek was intrigued by it and also found the Bible, which had belonged to Johnson Whittaker. My great-great-grandfather used his own personal Bible as a diary to chronicle all of the malicious attacks that had occurred with him at West Point. And it was seized as evidence in the court-martial. The family never saw it again. 22 years after court-martial was released, and by the way, that book was not widely circulated. It was pretty much in libraries and was not in major bookstores. So 22 years later, in 1994, the book was re-released to coincide with a movie produced by Showtime entitled Assault at West Point. And you see on the left a picture of the cast of Assault at West Point. So from left to right, we have Seth Gilliam, played my great-great-grandfather in the movie when he was at West Point. There's my grandmother, the late Cecil Whittaker Paquette. To the right of my grandmother is Samuel Jackson, played Richard Greener. And to the right is Sam Waterston, recognized from Law and Order. He played Daniel Chamberlain. The movie was shot at the Virginia Military Institute in Lexington, Virginia. My grandmother was paid as an extra and consultant. So if you had watched the movie prior to our presentation tonight, or if you watch it after tonight, you'll see in the actual scene where my great-great-grandfather is testifying, you'll see my grandmother. She has on a pink outfit with an antebellum type hat. And she enjoyed being in the movie. She enjoyed meeting Samuel Jackson. The network also had my great-grandmother tour around the country for a promo of the film. So I believe this was in New York City. So they had to go to New York. They flew to New York, Columbus, Ohio. As a matter of fact, they had a premiere in Detroit, across the street from DPL at the Detroit Institute of Arts. And Dennis Arch and other dignitaries from the city of Detroit came, and my family members and I were there to view the film. This film was so moving that it touched the congressional and Senate delegation from South Carolina in Washington, D.C. So you had, at that time, for the U.S. Senate, you had Ernest Hollings, and also you had Strom Thurmond. And then for the congressional representation, not all the congressmen in South Carolina supported, but the two major ones were James Spratt, and Jim Clyburn. You recognize the name Jim Clyburn. He was a trailblazer because in 1992, he was elected the first African-American congressman from South Carolina since Reconstruction. And they proposed that a posthumous commission be given to the family, which would give my great-great-grandfather the rank of second lieutenant, and that is the rank he would have earned had he graduated on time. So I'll never forget, in June 1995, I was home a month after finishing my first year at Hampton. It was about 9 o'clock in the evening. The phone rang at my parents' house, but they answered the phone. It was the White House. So they said it was a done deal. The family would be flown, all expenses paid, to Washington, D.C. at the end of July. So when we arrived in Washington, we had two African-American military escorts from Fort Myer, which is above the Pentagon. They picked us up in a shuttle. They took us to dinner at a marina right by National Airport. We stayed in Crystal City. So this was on a Sunday evening. Next Monday was a whirlwind day. My father, myself, and Dr. Marszalek went over to D.C. and went to the CBS studios where my father and Dr. Marszalek were interviewed on CBS this morning. Came back to the hotel, reconvened with the family, taken to the Pentagon on a tour, and we had a luncheon in one of the officers' dining halls in the Pentagon. After that, across to Washington, D.C., and you'll see a picture in a minute where we were at the White House, and we were ushered directly to the Oval Office, met President Clinton, and then we went across the hall to the Roosevelt Room where the actual ceremony took place, which you'll see in a few minutes. And after that, we had a stakeout and flew back to Detroit. Next slide, please. So this was after the presentation of the posthumous commission. On the left is my mother, Pamela Boykin. Of course, there's myself, President Clinton, my cousin, Jason Waddell. And another thing I want to add too is that the Bible was returned to the family. My grandmother took it down to South Carolina State the next year, 1996, for the centennial. Unfortunately, when my father and I went on a trip to South Carolina about 11 years ago to inter my grandmother's ashes at the family plot, we found out that the Bible was moved from the Whittaker Library and put in the safety deposit box of a bank in town. So my father actually got a chance to look at it, took pictures, and I'm going to keep the Bible for access to the family so everybody's seen it, and then we'll try to get my family members and I to be on one accord so we could possibly donate it to the Smithsonian Museum of African American History in Washington, D.C., where the whole world would be able to appreciate it. So that's another chapter in the story that's working on, so stay tuned with that. So what we'll do with the time remaining is watch the White House ceremony. So after I finish giving the little introduction here, Kalani, you can click on that and I'll give you instructions. So we'll see the actual ceremony, which is about 9 minutes, and the press stakeout, come back with the short duration of time that's left. I will entertain any questions. So I'll put myself on mute.
Denied it on a sham setup that's just stunning in its violence and prejudice. What happens at the military academy is he was silenced for 4 years, and just a few weeks before graduation, they were determined that he not receive it. And so they entered his room, beat him up, and left him unconscious, and thereafter court-martialed him on the premise that, look, the white cadets under the honor code would never lie. Therefore, he must have done it to embarrass West Point. And if you can imagine, in those days, the environment of the court-martial panel, the authorities at West Point, the cadets themselves all joining in that nonsense. President Jester Arthur, he reversed it, but it was too late because Whittaker had been put out as a result of so-called flunking a philosophy exam. It was a verbal exam, and he couldn't be graded otherwise. He came back, and I think this is a significance because many will say this rights or wrong. Yes, it rights or wrong, but not for Whittaker. It's too late. It's for us. The wrong in our hearts and minds with respect to equal justice under law. Here's a man who was denied every bit of it, but went along to be a civic leader, a lawyer back in South Carolina, a high school principal, a professor there at the university, and otherwise his son served as the third president of State College. So we really celebrate and honor his steadfastness and his perseverance under the harshest of circumstances. Are there any questions, Steve?
The end of the story, Senator?
The end of the story. We had a little exercise this morning, laid a wreath there because Whittaker's buried at State College. We've got the library named after him. One good thing is that he kept a Bible, and a lot of the evidence came out by his daily notes in the back part of that Bible, which was seized and put into the court-martial record and kept in the archives of America. For all these years, President Clinton presented that Bible back to the family, and Ms. Piquet, his granddaughter, says she's granting it to the State College to be displayed there next year. 1996 is its 100th anniversary, and what they're going to do is display that Bible. It'll be then displayed from now on at the Whittaker Library, named after his son at State College.
How and when did you get onto this case?
There was a wonderful producer of a show up there west of a film of the book by Piquet. Piquet had written, by Mazarek. Mazarek had written the book, and when West called me, I'd worked with him on the Agent Orange thing and gotten that wrong righted. It took me 2 years for this one, but we thank President Clinton. He's the one that's done it.
Make some kind of a showing, some sort of a legal showing?
Oh, yeah, we made it. We filled up the records. We put in a hearing. We made speeches on the floor of the Senate. But everybody always questioned whether or not they were just fluffing me off by saying, well, we don't know that we can grant a commission. It'll have to be the president. They should have done this long ago.
Many people would argue that racism still exists in our society, that it hasn't been totally eliminated. Do you think it's been totally eliminated at West Point?
I would think so. West Point was totally cooperative. They'd have to answer for themselves. You're right about us. I think there's more racism in South Carolina today than what it was 35 years ago when I was governor.
Why is that?
You go down there and ask. There's a lot of reasons.
You sit on the budget committee. Could we ask you about the budget? The president made a speech this morning, sort of like throwing down the gauntlet or whatever you want to say. Would you suggest perhaps that he try to avoid what we keep saying is a train wreck October 1st? Would you suggest maybe a budget summit early on?
It would be a good idea because there's no rhyme, no reason to close down the government, but evidently that's the strategy now of our leadership over on the House side. They just throw the book at any and everything. You know, do away with departments of commerce, energy, education, housing, get rid of the economic policy council, get rid of the Office of Technology Assessment, public television, any and everything. Just get rid of it all with no regard for their functions and their value. And with that kind of environment, I think it'd be good if we could get together ahead of time.
Do you think it's going to happen?
I don't know. It'll be up to the leadership of the Republican Congress, I guess. Thank you.
Affirmative action, don't you?
Yeah. Do I believe in affirmative action? Yeah, I voted and supported it, but I think it served its purpose and it's now gotten kind of productive. Thank you all very much.
Well, I'm Jim Clymer from South Carolina. I represent the 6th Congressional District, the district that Mr. Whittaker lived most of his life in and is now buried in. And it's a pleasure for me to be here today to see the president right this 115-year wrong that was done to this gentleman who gave so much. I also have another relationship with Mr. Whittaker. At one time when he was in school, he roomed with my great-great-uncle, George Washington Murray, who was the last black person to serve in the Congress from South Carolina until I got elected in 1992. So this had a very personal kind of relationship for me, and I'm pleased to be here to be a part of it.
Congressman, can you give us any kind of feeling at all as someone of African heritage, what it feels like when it takes more than 100 years to right what to you and to so many other people was so obviously an injustice?
Well, it feels like gradualism. That's what it feels like. That's it's somewhat of a disease that we have in our nation. We're on our way, but I would hope that people will recognize from this kind of a ceremony and the history that led to this, the life of this gentleman, but recognize what it is that goes on in the hearts and minds of so many people of African descent as they try to go about carrying out their duties and responsibilities as Americans. And that's why you see such a great divide developing in the country when you talk about things like affirmative action having outlived its usefulness. How can you possibly say that? What we did here today was an affirmative act to correct a long-time wrong. And there are a lot of other affirmative acts that need to be made to correct some wrongs. And I think that as we can continue along this way, you'll see some other stories like this developing. And I would hope that people will recognize what it really means.
Congressman, do you agree with the senator that there's more racism in South Carolina than when he was governor today?
I don't know if I would say there is more. I would say that we still have a significant amount of racism in South Carolina, in the country for that matter. I don't think that South Carolina is any different from the rest of the country. From what I've been reading about here of late, the same thing is going on in California. And so I would not point South Carolina out. I suspect, though, that we are going to begin to see even more headlines because I think people are now beginning to recognize that these kinds of things are better dealt with out in the open, and we can't continue to ignore them. I recall when I first moved to Charleston back in 1962, right out of South Carolina State University, I met with some of the old Charleston elite. They're down on the Battery. who told me that one of the biggest problems of trying to resolve race problems is that there was a certain point that we got to in our discussions where we would stop talking. And people just don't feel that you can really resolve these problems unless you talk about them. And so for us to continue to ignore them or continue to pretend that they aren't there causes more problems than it's worth. And so we have to continue to talk about them. Sure.
What town did you say you're from?
I'm from South Carolina,
Whittaker.
Orangeburg. I represent Orangeburg and Columbia and Charleston, all of which, and of course, my parents came out of Kershaw where he was born.
Tell us what this means to you and your family, what this day means to you.
This is a happy day, a proud day, and it means that there's a lot of hope for America. There's a lot of hope for the family. There's a lot of hope for all of our citizens, because we hear so much in the news about the bad news instead of the good news. And this is some good news that I think should be spread. And it just means a lot to me today.
Does this close a chapter for you? Is there some closure here?
It closes one end, but the open end is the youth that will still go on and carry on the family tradition, but it closes the history end. And it made me feel very proud today, and it made every family member feel very proud.
Did you think this day would come? You've been fighting for this for a while.
I had hoped it would come before I died. As I got older and older, I didn't know whether I would live to see it. But I'm very happy that it came while I was still alive and able to appreciate it and see it.
Have you seen the Bible before today, Mr.
I've never seen it. I just heard about it.
You're seeing it today.
Yes, I knew that his mother had given him the Bible when he left for West Point, and that it was a source of comfort to him, because John Marszalek had seen it, he said, when he was researching the archives, and he had seen the writings into it. And I knew my grandfather was a religious man, because when he used to come to Detroit to visit us when I was a child, every morning he had a Bible then that he would have us kneel, and he would read a prayer for the morning before we would eat. So I knew he was a religious man, and he lived his religion.
Mr. Good, what kind of soldier do you think your grandfather would have made?
A good one. The reason I say that, although he was a mild-mannered man with me and his family, when he was principal of a high school, I heard people say that if there were any students who were rude or obstreperous, he would straighten his back in military form and point at them, and he could set them straight in a very firm tone of voice. He had a very firm manner about him when necessary.
Was this his dream to be rehabilitated in the eyes of the country?
Well, I think that he had hoped that someday something would happen, but it didn't happen during his lifetime. He would have stood proudly.
Did you ever talk about what happened to him?
No. I understand from some of the records that
Kalena?
teaching,
Yes.
Okay.
somebody asked him about it, he would refuse to discuss it.
How did you first hear the story? You recall somebody else in the family?
My mother, who had heard it from her mother-in-law, that was his wife, and my father. When my father and his brother came back from France, both had their commissions, and they put them in their father's lap and said, "Dad, they cheated you out of your commission, but between the two of us, here are three." My father was lieutenant and then captain, and his brother was the first lieutenant. They served in France, and they put their commissions in his lap.
Have you had a chance to look through the Bible yet? Have you seen
No,
any?
this is the first time I've ever seen it or put my hands on it.
Will you be carrying it to the college?
I will, yes. That's where I'm going to donate it and have it placed in the archives of South Carolina State University, of which I'm an alumnus. My uncle was president there. They're going to celebrate their 100th anniversary next year, 1896. And I was down in Orangeburg this spring and had a discussion with the librarian, and they do have archives and a place for it to be stored. And they said they would be very pleased to have the Bible there, and so did Senator Hollings and Strom, because he was born in South Carolina, he died in South Carolina, and he lived there quite a bit of the
Do you
time.
think that affirmative action has served its purpose, as Senator Hollins said?
Well, I'm sorry that there was a need for affirmative action. As has been said, that people should get jobs on their merit. Well, I believe that all along, but it wasn't happening. Because if it was happening, they would have never had to pass the affirmative action. So if that would start happening, then there would be no need for it. But that still isn't happening. It's better now than it was, but not as good as it should or is going to be.
Is there one lesson that can be drawn from this whole transaction?
Keep your head up, keep trying, do the best you can to achieve, and do anything you can to help others, and especially in education. We still need a lot of educating, and if you can do something to help educate other people, just keep trying.
Can we get his grandsons from Detroit, I believe? Or
These are great-grandsons.
great-grandsons?
Yeah. I'm the oldest living member who still knew him. This is great-grandson Ulysses Whittaker Boykin, and this is great-grandson John R. Whittaker.
Gentlemen, what do you think this means to your family and maybe a little bit more than that, even to the nation?
I think it means a great deal to the family. It represents, as was stated earlier, a closing of the early end. It now sets up 4 generations of commissioned officers, which now started with my great-grandfather, my grandfather, my uncle, and myself. And it means a lot, I think, to a lot of people who had never heard this story before. And it's something that can serve as a guide to our youth, to people who are down, to keep trying, that there may be many obstacles. The obstacles may be different today, but they're still out there, that if you work hard enough, it's possible to overcome them. And it's served as a great source of pride for us, because sometimes when we would get down and in trouble and we would just think about what he had undergone, and we knew the legacy that he left, and it meant a lot to us to live up to that, because he had overcome so much, had become a lawyer, an educator, even after suffering these terrible wrongs against him, so that we certainly had to try and achieve and do things in his footsteps.
Dr. Whittaker?
Yes.
What do you think it means for the nation, I guess, or for the military, perhaps?
I think it does a lot to restore faith in the system. We hear so much about the system failing groups of people, and it's not a perfect system, but it does show that you can, through the means that we have available, restore some of or correct some of the wrongs and right them. So personally, it means that the system has worked in this case, and it does a lot to restore that faith.
Do you think there's still racism in the system?
I don't think any society is free of racism, and I don't think that we'll ever see the end of it. If you look through history, there's always been some sort of racism, but these things can be overcome by various means, and it shows that we have one means at our disposal to overcome racism. I don't think we'll ever be free of racism, but I think it can be combated.
Congressman Spratt? Could you remark a little bit about what kind of struggle this was to get this to happen?
Well, to illustrate what a struggle it was, this is not the only cadet who was waiting justice. The first black cadet admitted to West Point also came from South Carolina. His name was James Webster Smith. And when we introduced this bill and offered this amendment on the House floor, 2 names were included: Whittaker's name and also James Webster Smith's name. James Webster Smith was the first cadet, and everything that happened to Cadet Whittaker happened to him. except that he didn't have the family, nor did he live the life. He died 2 years later of tuberculosis while teaching school, to prove through his own life and through his children and grandchildren what an injustice was visited upon him. We're still waiting on the Army to vindicate the name of James Webster Smith and do the same thing that was done here today for Whittaker.
Why is it so difficult?
Well, the Army doesn't want to make a mistake about the historical record. In the case of James Webster Smith, that record was documented in a biography of Ulysses S. Grant by William S. McFeely some years ago. McFeely had no particular axe to grind. He was not actually writing a story about James Webster Smith. He was using his life and his experience, his horrible experience as a first black cadet at West Point, to illustrate the temper of the times in 1870, 1871. And so that particular piece of dispassionate history, no axes to grind, is on record, and I think the Army ought to act on it. They're having an historical review made of it. They promised me months ago they would complete it within 6 months. They haven't done so. So I partly came over here today to join in this celebration because this is something to celebrate. This was richly deserved. But I also wanted to remind the Secretary of the Army that there are other files pending. And this in particular, James Webster Smith, is a very meritorious case, much like Johnson Chestnut Whittaker.
Next slide. Okay, so at this time, we have plenty of time for questions. So please hit, if you go to the toggle bar at the bottom, you see reactions, hit the raise hand. And make sure you click off after you hit raise hand. So we have any questions at this time? Okay, yes, Mr. Jordan.
You can call me Tracy.
Okay, Tracy, yes. Okay, go ahead, Tracy.
Yeah, I'm curious. The book was called Court Martial. Is that the same name as the movie? I didn't.
Well, the original book was called Court Martial, came out in 1972. The re-release book and movie are called Assault at West Point.
Okay.
And the movie is available on YouTube for free. And actually, it came on, for those of you who have cable or digital television, it came on Bounce TV for the first time this summer. I was out of town, and my wife's godbrother called and said, Assault at West Point, because I told him about the story, and I was just so elated to see it on cable TV, because prior to that, it was usually rerun on Showtime for Black History Month or a UHF station in major cities throughout the country, but it's called Assault. And the book is still available too on Amazon, so you can find it on Amazon. I highly recommend you read the book first. Pretty much everything in the book coincides with the movie. I know sometimes Hollywood will adulterate things and misconstrue things, but everything is pretty much 100%. And also want to add, I did go to Washington, D.C. 3 summers ago, and I went to the National Archives. My wife was having business in D.C., and I spent a day there, and I did look at some of the 10,000, 12,000 page transcript, and the archivist who assisted me was an African-American man. He said he had seen the movie, and I told him I was his, Johnson Whittaker's great-great-grandson. So he wrote out the red carpet for me and said, whatever you want, he'll help you. So, and just reading the language, the verbiage of the time, it just shows how mendacious the rhetoric was, and just how nefarious the social climate was, towards him. So once again, I hope you get a chance to see the movie and also get the book. Any other questions? Great, thank you. Anyone else? Yes, Barbara. Unmute yourself, Barbara. Barbara?
Might help if I got off of mute. Yeah,
Okay.
continuing the subject of the movie, how well advertised or circulated was that movie? I'm just wondering because I'm not familiar with it. Was it just a regional movie? Was it?
Oh no! It was international. I mean, it came out all over Showtime. It was very well advertised. Like I said, they had the promotional tour, which my grandmother traveled with Samuel L. Jackson, Seth Gilliam, and Sam Watterson, major cities to promote it, even before it came on cable. So it was very well promoted, and we were ecstatic that Showtime took on the daunting task of telling the story, because actually we were talking with Professor Marslack, and he said they had planned a movie some years before, because it came out in 1994. They were planning it back in the 80s. Because once again, the book came out in 72.
Yeah, got the book.
And
Okay.
Dr. Marslak was saying that they just had to find the right network of producers. And the producer of it, as Senator Hollings mentioned, was Harry Moses. He did a piece, I don't know if you all saw years ago, I think back in the 80s, 60 Minutes had an expose on Agent Orange, the effects of Agent Orange on Vietnam vets. So he's the one that produced the film. So as you can see, he's someone who produces films with, subjects that are very mind-boggling and get you thinking.
Yeah, so yeah, I could see they're first-rate actors.
Oh yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I just didn't know if it made the theaters. I mean, in
No,
terms
no,
of,
it did not make the theater because
yeah, that's what I was wondering.
even when we found out the movie was being made, they said it was going to be made for TV. It's not going to hit the theater. And
Yeah,
that
I
was
mean,
some
I
our
think
fa-
it should hit the theaters. I mean, this is
Oh, I
a,
concur.
a
I concur
story
wholeheartedly
that I
with that.
think we should advocate for that.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Yes, I agree with you, Barbara.
Especially with all of this the trying to reverse the with a critical race theory
Oh
not
gosh,
being taught in the schools, and
it's just a
so
total
our young people need
abomination.
to know this story.
Yes, I agree. I agree. And to add as an addendum, I had petitioned. Many of you are familiar with From Slavery to Freedom by Dr. John Hope Franklin, which has been the standard for African American history in colleges. I had that book when I was at Hampton, and now I'm using that book as a professor at the community college. So about 10 years ago, McGraw-Hill, which is a major publisher of history textbooks, took on the rights of the book because it was independent before. And so I wrote them, and I never heard back from them. Then, this past spring, my mentor, Professor Robert Watson, sent me a screenshot on a text message. There's another history, African American history book out. I forgot who the author is. And he said, Mr. Boykin, they mentioned your great great grandfather. And I showed it immediately. I texted my dad, my cousin Liz, and the whole family. We were ecstatic about it. And actually, another one of my mentors knows the authors of the book. I think they were from Ohio, and they went to Wilberforce, if I'm not mistaken. So I went on eBay and ordered a copy of that book. I said, I'm definitely going to have a copy of that book, for my own personal record. So it prides me to see that at least one history textbook has it, but my U.S. history textbook, they have no mention of it. Because people need to understand that he paved the way for Henry Flipper, and, well, I'm sorry, not Flipper. He paved the way for Colonel Charles Young, the first fraternity brother of mine, the first African-American high-ranking officer in the military, the Tuskegee Airmen, all those other individuals. So they need to know that someone had paid the price in order for them to have the successes that were afforded to them. Thank you,
I have
Barbara.
one more quick question.
Oh, go ahead.
I
Go ahead.
see
Got plenty of
Linda
time. Got
has
about
a
half
question.
hour.
So,
Yes.
so I'm just wondering too, sometimes after books are published and movies are made, that additional facts are discovered just from that exposure. And there may be some persons that had added information about incidents, or more information about what happened to your great grandfather. I was just wondering if you had
Well,
anything
actually,
new that you
what-
could do a sequel to. I'm trying to get a sequel.
I don't know
to
about sequel, but
this. I'm promoting it to a full
right.
Academy
There was-
Award level movie.
Right. No, I agree with you wholeheartedly. There was a can of basically this opened up a whole can where not only was my great great grandfather harassed, but also even some of the white cadets. There was an expose where the high-ranking officials at West Point were relieved of their duty because there was hazing going on, even amongst the white cadets. So it wasn't just a racial thing too, but it was just the whole culture of West Point at the time was not fostering. You go into the army, so you're enduring discipline, but there was no discipline because there was no control of the behavior of the higher ranking cadets. Linda Sampson has a question. Yes, go ahead, Linda. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Peter. Let me say that too.
Yes, Linda, you had a question? Linda? She unmuted. I think we're having some. Linda, are you there? Okay.
She's unmuted.
Linda, can you speak? Okay.
Yeah, this is Linda, but I don't have a question. I just got on too late. Is this going to be on YouTube?
Oh, this has been what you mean, this whole program? It's been recorded. I will talk with Miss Gates to see.
Yes, it will be.
Yeah. Oh, it will be on
Thank
YouTube.
you.
Great, thank
Yes.
you. Yes, and I'll post it on. It'll be on Facebook, and also I'll have it on LinkedIn. Thank you. Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question. You mentioned that there were a lot of hazing going on at the West Point, but for Whittaker, in Whittaker's case, he was bound and he was cut with razors and things of that
Yes.
nature. So was the level of hazing the same for non-African Americans?
That is a very good question, and I really can't answer it, but I can basically hypothesize that maybe it was or maybe it wasn't. But I think, and my family members will probably concur, that it was probably even worse for my great-great-grandfather, since he was a person of color. And the same thing they did to him, they did to Henry O. Flipper too. But they allowed him to graduate. And after that, they said, okay, the next African-American cadet or cadets come in, we're going to make sure that they don't make it. And if you read about Henry O. Flipper's life, what he would have endured at West Point in the same magnitude as my great-great-grandfather, he actually endured when he was enlisted in the military. They pretty much drummed him out of the military because he allegedly was married to a white woman, had relations with him. So they gave him hell. Colonel Charles Young, who I mentioned before, who was a West Point grad, they tried to force him out of the military, saying he was unfit. So he rode a horse from Massachusetts, Ohio, which is right by Wilberforce, 3 hours south of Detroit, to Washington, D.C. to prove his fitness. And so they allowed him to stay in, but he kind of had a more menial role in the military. So it's been going on for a very long time. I tell people the story. One of my classmates from Hampton, I remember seeing her at the 5-year union. She was in ROTC in college, and she was stationed in the Hampton Roads area. A lot of military bases in Hampton Roads. You got Langley Air Force Base and also Deep Creek Naval Base. And she was stationed, I think, over in Norfolk. And she told me when she became a commissioned officer, the whites did not respect her at all, white males. And so she had to get out. I had another friend of mine, Amzie Moore, who's the son of a civil rights leader in Mississippi. Amzie went into the Navy before he came to Hampton. And he told me that he was on a ship out in the middle of the ocean. I forgot what the ranks are in the Navy, but someone who was ranked lower than him assaulted him in the middle of the ship at sea. And that young man was court martialed. My friend got the heck out of the Navy. So I just say this all to say that even today, we still see the same type of malice occur with African American men and women in the military. I mean, even West Point. I mean, I read a couple years ago, West Point graduated the first class of African American females, but they were getting harassed too. So it still goes on today. They say nothing is new under the sun, so it's still going on. Yes, T. Jordan, you have another
Yeah, nothing to take away from your great-great-grandfather, but I'm just so amazing. You made the point just a moment ago that the racism, still exists even today. And I was just wondering if you've ever heard of the Montford Point Marines.
Oh, yes. As a matter of fact, one of them is a member of my church, Bethel AME. Yes.
Okay. My father was one of the first Black Marines. Okay.
Wow.
They did not allow, they had a few Marines during the Revolutionary War. But
yes.
After the war was won and we became a nation, Blacks were not allowed into the Marine Corps. And so not until 1942 when we were involved in World War II. They
Yes.
allowed blacks in. They were segregated, but they were allowed to be Marines. And my father was one of the first ones. And he endured just some impossible discrimination on all fronts.
Yes.
They were separated from, it's normally Camp Lejeune. The whole place is called, the training area is called Camp Lejeune,
Yeah,
in
Camp
North
Lejeune, oh, yeah.
Carolina. Okay. But the blacks were segregated into a portion of it called Montford Point. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And in Montford Point, as opposed to the white Marines who were in, structured barracks and indoor plumbing and all that, the black Marines were in huts and with outdoor plumbing, dirt roads, all of that. And they trained 2 to 3 hours longer each day than the white Marines. Okay. Mm-hmm. So they were just totally exhausted every day, but they had to have a white Marine who resented that he had to do it. But anytime they wanted to go into town, they had to have a white Marine escort them. Okay.
But like a slave master.
Pretty much.
I'm not surprised.
Because they just knew you'd get in trouble or whatever, if you went by yourself, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And he told me stories about it. One that I will never forget is that after the training, he served in the South Pacific, and most of it at Pearl Harbor, loading, unloading ships, planes, and that type of thing, but also preparing for a possible second attack on Hawaii, and also to reinforce. There was a lot of people don't know it, but there was a black combat unit that fought in the South Pacific. And my understanding is, I haven't verified it for sure yet, but my understanding is that they were the second most decorated unit of World War II.
Yes.
The most decorated unit was a unit of Japanese Americans whose families were interned on the West Coast, who fought in Europe against the Germans, and they were the most highly decorated of all World War II. But anyway, getting back to my dad, he said when they disembarked after the war and came back in San Francisco, obviously had to take the train back to Camp Lejeune. And when they hit the border of Mississippi, there was a huge mob of white men, and they were saying that no N-words could take the train through Mississippi. And so they were armed and everything. And so my dad said that his commanding officer told all the Marines, black and white, that were on the train, stick your guns out the windows. And then he took a portion of the unit out in front of the mob, who were armed as well. And he told them, you're gonna move, you're gonna die. And they moved. I'll never forget that. Okay. But just these guys just fought a war for you, and you're gonna tell them they can't even ride a train. I just thought that was crazy. But anyway, I'm just mentioning that because it just reiterates the fact that the racism has continued through the years, and as you said, it still exists today.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. You come from a very proud legacy, just like I do. And during the World War II effort, it was called the Double V campaign, double V, meaning victory against Germany, but then also victory in the United States against racism. So African-American soldiers, I don't want to leave out the Japanese and Native Americans, they were fighting two battles, a domestic battle to be respected in mainstream society, and also they were fighting to protect American interests and the safety of the United States from being attacked by Germany or Japan. Any other questions? Let's see.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, Linda. Yes, go ahead.
Oh, you can hear me now.
Yes.
Okay, great.
And when you're finished answering the question, take your hand down so we're not confused, because there are others. Yeah, you can just hit the hand button down. Okay. Yes, go ahead, Linda.
Okay. Yeah. Do you have any information about Whittaker's life on the plantation in Camden?
It's chronicled in the book Assault at West Point in the beginning. So that's pretty much all that my family and I know about his life on the plantation. Now, he did have, what I read in there, he had a twin brother named James, and he died very young. But that's pretty much all I know from the plantation. Like I said, he was freed at age 8. So that's what Dr. Marzlak researched on his early life. So the first chapter opens up with his plantation life, and then it goes into as he evolved into a young man. So I have talked with an archivist in Camden about the plantation, the mulberry plantation. Actually, my father and I went there several years ago, and the plantation couldn't see the actual house. The original house is still standing, and I forgot to mention it's one of the largest plantations in the South, and also the largest in South Carolina. And I don't know who owns it now, but we couldn't get up on the house because there was a gate. But we did take a picture of it. But when I get back down to Camden, in that area, Camden, Orangeburg area, I plan on going to the archives to see if I can get more information on the mulberry plantation, and I will definitely share that with you, Linda.
Okay, thank you.
Barbara?
Yes, so I guess in the conversation a few minutes ago regarding occurrences in the wars, like World War I know that Nova Scotia just last month offered this huge apology to the number 2 construction battalion. This is the Canadians.
Yes.
But of course, a lot of our family members were Canadian and, since are here in the States. So Justin Trudeau offered that apology.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a really
Awesome.
big deal. Yeah, they invited, well, they put all the names of those who were soldiers and invited their descendants to come to witness that apology. But I couldn't make it. But so that's just making me, when I thought about that, I'm just wondering if if West Point actually offered anything similar, something comparable. It may not have been the extreme of the situation. It may not have been. I don't know that we can compare it when we're talking about hazing. But then again, there was that racism, and I was just wondering if they had something comparable, maybe to a lesser degree than what happened with the number 2 construction battalion apology.
That's a good, well, thank you for sharing that about our neighbors across the river. And that's important. You need to know that and what I tell my students is that Canada, they talk about Canada, the Underground Railroad. Canada's really not different than the United States. I mean, Malcolm X said, as long as you are south of Canada, you see racism in every corner. But really, I mean, Canada, they had slavery in Canada. They mistreated the indigenous people in Canada. So Canada pretty much was on parallel with the United States with its maintaining of white supremacy. But so Barbara, what I'm trying to gather, so are you asking me, did West Point ever offer a formal apology to my family? No, not that I know. I mean, it took the White House, as you can see, to offer that apology, but I will say this: one of my fraternity brothers who grew up in Detroit is a West Point grad. He's about 2 years older than me. When I first met him, he said, "I know the story about your great-great-grandfather." I said, "Really?" I said, his name is Ben. I said, "Ben, are they mentioned at West Point?" He said, "Yeah, they are mentioned at West Point." So they're mentioning it there, but they never really gave a formal apology. So, but I agree with you. They should have given an apology. With what happened with him and all the other cadets. And now I was talking about Colonel Charles Young. Now they finally decided to elevate his rank. I think he's been elevated now to a general, and that's the rank he should have got. He's been dead, I mean, for a very long time. He should have gotten this over 100 years ago. So it's just really, well, it's not mind-boggling, but it's just really unfortunate that you don't give people flowers while they're alive. You have to wait till after the fact when things happen. Because like my great great grandfather died in 1931. It wasn't until the end of the 20th century that they finally realized that this was wrong, what happened to him at West Point, and that he should have earned the rank of second lieutenant. And you mentioned critical race theory, or this is why we have to teach history. Start teaching these young people this information when they're young. If the schools don't want to teach it, teach it in the home. They can't stop us from teaching it in the home. I mean, my mom and dad immersed me in so many books on history when I was young. That's why I have such a keen fascination with history, is because of them. And there's no excuse now, because now, even though people don't read books, you have Kindle. I mean, you have Google, you have different sites. You can look up information. There's no excuse. There's no excuse. So don't the parents out here and grandparents, don't always depend on the school systems to teach your kids. We have the power to disseminate information with the internet and also through our griots or our elders in the family. Try to record information while people are still alive. It's so imperative.
Well,
Any
hopefully
other
an
questions?
apology is in the future.
You're right.
Never
We
too
got about
late.
12 minutes left. Any other questions? We'll hear from some other folks here. I appreciate those of you that participated. I know you have some questions to ask, comments. Anybody else? Anyone else? Well, I'll say this, and if you want to raise your hand, go ahead. I first learned about my great-great-grandfather's story when I was, I would say, about 9 or 10 years old. I was at my grandmother Cecil's home in Detroit, and I picked up the original book, Court Martial. I said, Grandma, what is this book about? She said, well, it's about your great-great-grandfather. I said, maybe wait a couple years. And when I was 13, 14, I read the whole book, and I said, wow, I mean, how could they do this to a man who's trying to be respected in serving his country and trying to break down the barriers at West Point? And I also heard too that the men who assaulted him were, you would think, okay, they were from the South. No, they were from like Iowa or Kansas, like prairie states. Okay, once again, it goes back to the statement I made that Malcolm X said that as long as you're south of Canada, you'll see racism. So those men, you probably ask, did their families ever know about it? They probably didn't. They never passed that information along. It's just like how some families don't pass down that they had owned slaves, but now you see that program Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates, and people, white folks are finding out that, hey, our family owned slaves. We're related, to African Americans. So it's just amazing what you find out in history. Anybody else? Got about 11 minutes left. Anybody else? Anybody else?
I do want to make a quick comment about your great great grandfather.
Yes, Kalena.
Was a teacher, a lawyer, a principal, and he worked in similar fields as you do. So do you think that his story and what he endured is the reason why you went into education and became a professor yourself?
Most definitely. Most definitely. He was a major inspiration for me going into education. I mean, I just thought it was just totally phenomenal that my great-great-grandfather went from being a slave to being an educator in the capacity, serving the capacity of a high school principal, teacher, and also a lawyer. I mean, that's black brilliance. And that's what I tell my students. I always show this film in my African American History 2 classes and U.S. History classes and for African American History Month. I tell them, you cannot let the obstacles that we are facing today in 2022 deter you from achieving your dreams. You can be anything you want to be. And I tell them, my great-great-grandfather and others at that period of time, they made it even with the bare minimum. They didn't have the internet, okay? They had secondhand books and, they were determined. They had tenacity. They had just passion to succeed and overcome the obstacles. And as Booker T. Washington said, cast your buckets down, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. And I tell the students, you got to pick yourself up by the bootstraps. You can't make excuses. At the community college, we have a lot of students who don't have a car. So you have the queue line, you have buses. There's no excuse. Our ancestors Booker T. Washington went to my alma mater, my dad's alma mater, Hampton. He walked 300 miles from the mountains of Virginia to the coastline. He didn't make an excuse. He was determined. We got to Hampton. He wasn't rich. He was a custodian. He used that to pay his room and board. And General Samuel Chapman Armstrong, the first president and founder of Hampton, was so impressed with him, he became his mentor and helped him to start Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Booker T. Washington was the first president of that institution. So yes, I so endeavored to mention that my great-great-grandfather was inspiration for me to be in education, because the torch has been passed through the generations, and it's just so imperative. We have to tell these stories. You look at the Jewish community, they pass down stories about the Holocaust, or the Japanese, we talked about the internment camps, they talk about that, and other cultures talk about forms of genocide. So we, the African American community, we need to do a much better job in teaching our own about stories like this, to show that people can overcome with perseverance, and they endure negative situations. Because I'll say this, and I'll allow time for the 7 minutes remaining. I had a student, African American female, said, "Professor Boykin, why do we have to?" This is my African American history 1 class. "Why do we have to talk about slavery? I'm tired about slavery." I said, "Listen, in order to make it to the present, you have to know the past, okay? And we can't succeed without struggle. Everybody's struggled through generations. No one has landed on a silver platter, or a crystal. Life's not a crystal stair, like Langston Hughes said. Everyone has had to struggle. Everyone's had to pull themselves up by the bootstraps to get where they are today. Someone had to make a sacrifice. So I had her mind changed by the end of the semester. She understood why we have to talk about slavery. You have to talk about the good and the bad. I mean, now that they want to talk about they want to glorify the Confederacy and white supremacy. Well, you have to understand slavery. Okay, you can't sugarcoat slavery and oppression. You have to talk about it. Okay. Anybody else? Kalana, while we're waiting, can you flash the last slide of my contact information before we go? Okay, so we're waiting for others. Feel free to call me anytime you have any questions, or if you want me to come out and speak to your employer, or church, or schools. There's my email address. Also, you can find me on LinkedIn, on Facebook, under Peter J. Boykin. I'll be more than happy to talk about my great-grandfather's story, and I've talked about other pertinent topics in African American history. So there's my contact information. Are there any other questions? We have about 5 minutes left. 5 minutes left. Anybody? Questions, comments?
Yeah.
Barbara?
Yeah, I just want to say this was excellent. I had no idea that we would be treated to this much information, this much detail, and information that is so personal to you and your family. Had no idea about the gravity of the insults that your great-grandfather endured.
Oh, yes. It was just, just totally mendacious. They would spit in his food. They wouldn't recognize him, saw him as, an invisible man. Like we said before, the same type of situations are going on even today. I'll mention an instance. About 10 years ago, I was out in Northville at one of the Wayne County parks. It was myself, a Hampton alum who was from Virginia, another Hampton alum who was from the Detroit area. So we had a shed. So we're setting up for the cookout, and these 3 white teenagers, males, run by us, jump up on our tables, and say, "Look at those monkeys over there." Yes, and this is in 2012. Yes, and so the gentleman the older alum who was from Virginia, he grew up in a small town. He said, "Nothing's changed." He said, "I moved up here to Detroit after Hampton got a job with Ford Motor Company," and he said, "While there were numerous opportunities in the North, Detroit is one of the most segregated metropolitan areas in the United States. But this will always be my city, no matter whether you gentrify it or not." I have to stand. That's why we have to teach young people this history, so they can stand up. Because if they don't know it, they won't be able to stand up. They'll be powerless. Okay. 1 minute left. Any last questions? Last
No,
questions?
I'm just so proud of you.
Thank you.
And I have to say something that personal. Yeah, I consider you like a nephew, just like with Curtis and Wade. And I'm just immensely proud of you.
Thank you, boss. Once again, I'm going to say as a closing, thank you again to Elena Gates and T. Jordan and the rest of the staff of the Detroit Public Library. Thank you all, the audience, for coming out tonight, taking time out of a busy schedule to spend time with me. And let's not make this the last time. Okay, let's stay in touch. Once again, here's my information on here. If you want to know just anything about African American history, feel free. You got my information. I can direct you to tons of sites that are for your own personal benefit, your grandkids, your kids, nieces, nephews, whatever, because it's all about sharing. I'm all about, sharing resources and ensuring that everybody is broadening their horizons. I mean, you're never too old. I mean, I'll say this lastly in closing. I learned a lot from my students. I mean, I've been out of college now 24 years, and I'm still learning. There's still a lot of things in history I'm learning, not just from my textbooks, but from my students. They bring in stuff, and I never close the door for them telling me about history facts that are not in the textbooks. The textbook can only teach you so much, and you can only learn so much in a semester. So I tell my students, at the end of the semester, I said, never stop learning. So we have to teach this information. We really do.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. We are running out of time now.
Yes.
I do like to thank you, Mr. Boykin, for providing such a wealth of knowledge to everyone who is attending. And on behalf of the Detroit Public Library, I'd just like to thank you again for providing us with this program and bringing forth some of the issues that we are still seeing today when it comes to white supremacy and just discrimination amongst people of color. So
yes, and hopefully you can have me back again soon for another discussion with the library.
It is definitely needed.
Yes, yes.
So
I appreciate the invitation.
All right. Yeah, great job, Peter. I'm Peter Boykin's cousin, and I really am grateful to the Detroit Public Library for allowing this to happen tonight.
Yes. Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, thank you, everybody.
Roy.
All right.
Enjoyed it immensely.
Yes, thank you, guys. You all have a good evening.
Great job, Peter.
Touch.
No.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good night. Be
Safe
safe.
and have a good night, everyone.
Okay.
Good night.
Bye.
Okay. Good night.
For that?
Okay, let's get you on the screen share. Okay.
All right.
Oh, wait, I have to make you a host. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Very good.
Okay, can you share the screen now or?
Let's see if this works. Share screen.
So you gotta ask first, because they might not know. What a thrill.
Okay, that works then.
All right. Is that coming through?
No.
No, it's.
I see a black screen.
Let's try this then. How about now?
There's one. I saw it flash quickly. One of them showed up.
It flashed
No.
really quick, but it flashed quick, but there's nothing there now.
Let's see here. I'm gonna unshare and reshare here.
Yeah, okay, that's what he's gonna do. He's gonna give it a shot.
Some advanced sharing options.
That part's coming up.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to see if I was not doing something right.
Oh no, it might be on my end. Is that coming through?
No.
No.
All right. We're gonna do this the old-fashioned way then.
There.
Oh, I guess
Okay, there
that.
we go. Okay.
That works. Okay. Well, hey, I guess we
Now
can
we
roll
see
with
it.
this. Okay.
All right, I'm going to mute myself and I hope that everybody can mute themselves except for our speaker, okay?
All right. And just to confirm that the title slide is up, correct?
Yes.
Yes.
No.
Uh-oh, I heard a no.
No. Yes, there's a no here.
Uh-oh. It's
Yeah, I can see it. I can see our island jewel, Detroit's Belle Isle Park. I see
thanks,
it.
Jamon. Thank you. Okay. Well, all right. Well, thanks everybody. Yeah, sorry about it's always something new with Zoom. I swear there's always an update or something like that. It's really excited to be coming to you Zoom or otherwise though. It's you know, this was my my home library. This is probably the library I spent you know, the largest chunk of my life at. It's the old you know, main branch of the DPL. So it's really cool to get to do this. My name's Brendan Roney. I'm the manager of digital projects at the Detroit Historical Society. I've been at the Detroit Historical Society for about 16 years now in various capacities. These days, one of the things I spend a lot of my time with is working with our AP collection and with our photo and two-dimensional collection, scanning things and stuff like that. And one of the cool kind of outward facing things I get to do are these speakers bureaus. And this is one of our more popular ones, obviously. This is our island jewel, Detroit's Belle Isle Park. I'm betting a lot of folks here have great personal ties to the island. It's one of my favorite places. I used to work there every weekend. In my early days with the Detroit Historical Society over at the Dawson Great Lakes Museum, I've canoed the canals. I've had picnics there. I used to, I played Scrabble on the beach for some reason. I've got all kinds of fun there. And then memories going back to my childhood, to the old zoo and the playscape and the giant slide and stuff like that. And because Belle Isle was so beloved going way back, we have tons of great old postcards showing the island over the years, like the one in the background of this slide. This is a particularly great one for a couple reasons here. First of all, look who's in the scene. We've got women clad in those bulky turn of the century outfits rowing. In the 1890s, right around 1900, there wasn't that many sort of proper quote unquote athletic outlets that were available to women in those days, and things like cycling and rowing, and we'll get to cycling in a minute, were popular endeavors, and you know, Belle Isle, a great place to do both. We've got 4 women up on the bridge in the background, unchaperoned as far as we can tell right there, enjoying the time out on the island. Oh, I just realized my air is still going. I'm gonna kill that so it's not causing any kind of audio interference there. Speaking of Belle Isle and air conditioning, great when we didn't have that, that's where you went. So had those 4 women up on that bridge there had turned around, you'd get an interesting view. This is this particular bridge isn't one that's still standing. This is roughly behind where the casino is right now. I think there's just pretty modern looking green metal one there. And if they turned around and looked behind them, they're kind of beyond what we can see in the space, there'd be an adjacent bridge with a band shell on top that we'll see later in this presentation. If you look underneath the bridge, I don't know if my mouse pointer comes in here, but if you look just underneath the bridge, you see benches along the shore of the canal there where people could sit and listen to music from the adjacent band shell, or they could float in their canoes. This is also a really cool scene because the canoe in the center, if you're just kind of gently paddling by some friends, that's a not quite the position you have your paddle in. So they might be getting ready to splash one of their pals there, hopefully one of their pals. So kind of a nice playful scene on the canals of Belle Isle here. So let's jump into it, and we got to start somewhere. So let's start with, this plays along here. All right. One of the things the island's been known for up until, I guess, next year is as a home for world-class racing. Beginning back in 1992, Roger Penske of Penske Oil brought the Detroit Grand Prix onto the western end of the island. Previously, the race was held in downtown, But after regular complaints about viewing space and angles down there, the race was moved to Belle Isle. Setup during this period began generally around March. It was a bit later this year. And in the weeks leading up to the race, you can actually sort of test drive on the track. But mind you, those 15-mile-an-hour speed limits on Belle Isle are enforced pretty strictly these days. For 2023, the race is going to return back downtown. We'll see how well that's received, how they tackle the viewing angle issues and things like that. Now, of course, auto racing isn't the only kind of racing on and around Belle Isle. There's also powerboat racing. There's been a series of hydroplane races held on the Detroit River for over 100 years. It's been on hold the last couple of years, but the most recent incarnation of these races was the Detroit Hydro Fest. Prior to that, there's the Thunder Fest and the Harmsworth Cup Race and the Gold Cup Race. The Gold Cup is one of the oldest events in motorsports. It used to kind of be nomadic. Where the race would be held each year would be on the previous year's winner's home turf. So back in 1915, there was a boat called the Miss Detroit, which was funded by a group of Detroit businessmen to, kind of bring glory to the city and bring the trophy to the city in the race here. And it did just that. So beginning in 1916, the Miss Detroit brought the race here. In 1917, a guy by the name of Gar Wood came onto the scene, and he was one of the first kind of superstars of motorsports in the early 20th century. And he had a series of boats called the Miss America. We see the Miss America 10 in the image here. Garwood's on the left. That's Orland Johnson, his mechanic, on the right. They'd have a ride-in mechanic to, tweak all those engines. There's 4 Packard engines powering this thing. And Garwood kept the Gold Cup in Detroit for a good number of years. Very colorful guy too. And kind of a multi-talented guy too. After his racing days, he went on to patent the compactors that were used in garbage trucks. So for a good long time, there was Garwood emblazoned on the back of a garbage truck. So kind of a weird way of honoring a guy, but hey, he invented the compactor, so why not? Or at least patented a version. So you don't need 4 fancy Packard engines or a fancy jet turbine engine to race around Belle Isle. There's also people-powered boats. The Detroit Boat Club isn't just the name of a building. The actual club is still in operation and has been since 1839, which makes it the oldest continuously operated rowing club in the United States. Sailboat racing is still a constant too. There's often races happening on the river and on Lake St. Clair. And of course, there's racing on foot, skates, bicycles, model boats, and if you really want to stretch the device here, you can race after baseballs and cricket balls and my favorite frisbees on Belle Isle. Sheila Young, the Olympic speed skater who took home the gold medal in the 1976 Winter Olympics, trained on Belle Isle's canals when they were frozen. And in the Summer Olympics, Sheila Young was an Olympic cyclist. And bicycle racing goes back to the 1880s and the 1890s on Belle Isle. A big bicycle race was held every year on Decoration Day, which was kind of the proto version of Memorial Day in the city. And it was a bit of a rivalry with Chicago, where the press would compare how elaborate the prizes for the winners of the bicycle races in each city were. And having the bicycle race on Decoration Day, just honoring Civil War soldiers, was kind of also controversial. It's kind of considered a bit frivolous too. So, but bicycle racing, long history there, and plenty of cyclists out any given day on the island. The Detroit Free Press Marathon includes a lap around the island, as well as stretches along the Ambassador Bridge and through the Detroit Windsor Tunnel, making it the only international underwater marathon. One of my favorite things, the Model Yacht Basin, used to host regattas of boats built by Detroit public school kids. It was a shop class thing, industrial arts thing. You'd get a set of uniform plans, you'd build this model yacht that you'd rig up to interact with the wind to turn or go straight, and you'd race them with other school kids across the Model Yacht Basin. And the model yacht basin's still there. You might have seen it, not known what it is. If you're taking the outer road, the Strand along Belle Isle, once you go past, it's between the Dawson Great Lakes Museum and the Coast Guard station there. It's a square pool in the ground. It's got kind of like a cinder block or stone edges around it. You generally don't see too many people racing model yachts there anymore. That's kind of an old timey thing, but believe it or not, my dad has brought his old one out there from time to time to do a little spin across the pool there. So if you do see anybody, say hi, because maybe it's him. This is a great time to mention that too, because currently at the Dawson Great Lakes Museum, we have an exhibit up of almost all the model ships in our collection, and all different types, from artistic models or to working models like these model yachts. And we have a whole wing of one of our cases with these pond yachts on display. And when the sun goes down, we can't forget about the submarine races. Although these days, I think they boot you off the island around 10 o'clock. I joke, but we really did have submarines in Detroit. It's kind of our own version of McHale's Navy, right over at the Broadhead Naval Armory, just opposite Belle Isle. Never did see those guys racing though. And as another plug for the Dawson, you can of course find the periscope to one of the submarines that was stationed in Detroit, the USS Tambor, set up in the Dawson Great Lakes Museum, so you can make sure there's no U-boats coming down the Detroit River there. The USS Tambor served in Midway. In addition to the Tambor, there was some other subs that were stationed over at Broadhead at various times, like the Ciro and the Amherst. So one of the constants on Belle Isle is, of course, the family reunion. They're constantly going on there, and family get-togethers and picnics and things like that are well represented in our collection here. And we've got a nice spread of photos from our collection, ranging from kind of the era of the straw boater hats to the nice plaid pants here. And of course, we've got more modern ones to show too. Go to Belle Isle any given day or any given weekend, and there's surely one of the shelters will be a bunch of folks with matching family reunion shirts there. It's a great thing to see. So let's dive into the island's early history. The native Chippewa or Ojibwa and the Ottawa or Odawa populations knew the island as Swan Island. When the British arrived in the area, they purchased the island in 1768, and the purchase was negotiated by a guy by the name of Lieutenant George McDougall. And this is in the image here, we've got the original deed and the wampum belt that was part of that transaction. And these are both in the collection of the Burden Historical Collection over at the main branch of the DTL. In addition to the belt, the transaction included 8 barrels of rum, 3 rolls of tobacco, 3 pounds of vermilion dye, 3 pints of paint, and the belt. So Lieutenant George McDougall was orchestrating this sale on behalf of the British Crown. This was kind of an official purchase. It moved into private hands in 1793 when it was purchased by a guy by the name of William Macomb, who paid about $100,000 in today's money. Macomb was a big property owner on both sides of the river, and I would be remiss to note that property in this era includes not only land but people. Macomb, as we would pronounce his name now, was one of the largest slave owners in the region here. You might be more familiar with William's nephew, General Alexander Macomb, to use the more modern pronunciation of his name, who was in the War of 1812. And he's the guy in the statue on Washington Boulevard, downtown with the big cape and all that, and is the namesake of Macomb County. In 1817, Macomb's heirs then sold the island to another private individual, a guy by the name of Barnabas Campo. Barnabas Campo is the younger brother of Joseph, for any of you familiar with Hamtramck's main thoroughfare. And that transaction was for $92,000 in today's money. In 1879, the city of Detroit comes into the picture, and they purchased the island for about $5 million in today's money, and they budget 3 times that for buildings, bridges, and other improvements. So what was going on the island in these days? Well, one of the things, about to say Bablo, that's a whole different presentation. One of the things Belle Isle was known for in these days was that it was a popular spot for dueling. People, it was in the river. It was kind of outside the purview of authority. People would come from Malden, or Amherstburg as we know it today. They'd step away from the authorities and settle their business on the island at 20 paces and pistols. A well-known one was in 1820, when there was a guy by the name of Arthur Rankin who had a bit of a reputation as a drunken lout. He got into a quarrel with a guy by the name of Henry Richardson, who had a bit of a reputation as a lawyer. And they set out to Belle Isle to settle it like quote unquote gentlemen. Rankin ended up winning, although Richardson did survive. Right. Now, it wasn't all just duels and stuff on the island. For the most part, it was a place of tranquility and industry. We've got an image of the Robert Hopkin painting here, Comment ça va? French essentially for how you doing? The 3 in the canoe in the foreground are farmers out to sell produce to passing ships. In the background, we see Belle Isle. And if you look right on the tip of the island, you see a bit of a red blur. There's buildings on the island. There's actually some structures on the island, including even a tavern on the eastern tip at the time. The island was, in a lot of ways, a working place. It was home to 3 different fisheries. Fish would be caught and stored in pens on the island until they needed to be shipped out. In winter, workers would harvest and store blocks of ice to supply the city during the hotter months. And of course, being covered with trees, it was also the home to logging operations. And Belle Isle really could have remained sort of an industrialized spot, sort of an extension of the city's riverfront. Early on, there were plans to run a railroad tunnel under the river. And the spot they thought to do it. And again, I don't know if this is coming through, but my cursor there, if you look closer to downtown, almost where the automotive tunnel is now, you see abandoned tunnel on the map that should be up on your screen right now. Workers started to dig a railroad tunnel under the Detroit River direct, and they ran into gas pockets and had to abandon the plan. So they went back to the drawing board and they said, instead of running that single longer tunnel across the river, they could run a short tunnel from kind of the far end of Belle Isle there and have a bridge connecting it to the mainland of Detroit. They'd have a switching yard on the island. And that's what this 1874 map here shows. There'd still be some concessions though on the island. There'd still be a beach, but there would have been an asylum and a quarantine hospital. So not quite the the getaway we know it today. But luckily for us, the City Beautiful movement was gaining steam in this period. And the aim of the City Beautiful movement was to kind of set off the ills of industrial cities with parks and beautiful architecture. And Detroit was one of the places that this movement took root. In fact, the city set up a Parks and Boulevards Commission to pursue this. And one of their initial contributions, because of their name, was it sounds like Belle Isle is getting industrialized right there. The Parks and Boulevard Commission, one of their first contributions was Grand Boulevard, which was, in kind of modern parlance, was sort of a green space, a belt encircling what were at that point the city limits. It was too late to do anything with a riverfront in terms of the City Beautiful movement, though. Unlike a lot of other cities that maintained riverfront parks, ours was warehouses and factories going back pretty early on. It's only really been it's been kind of a dream of much of the 20th century, but it's only really been the last couple of decades that we started to undo this with well, I guess we could go back even further to Park Plaza and the Riverfront Park before that, but with like Shane Park in the 1980s, and that gave way to the Riverwalk more recently. So without the Riverfront to be sort of this getaway that the City Beautiful beholders of the City Beautiful movement wanted to create, they looked at Belle Isle instead. And to do this, they initially hired Frederick Law Olmsted of New York Central Park fame to do this, one of kind of the big names in the City Beautiful movement. There was some pushback though. Some people argued that Belle Isle was too far out of town. Remember I said Grand Boulevard was the outskirts right there. And the streetcars of the day only went as far as Mount Elliott. So you had another half mile to hoof it to get over to the, if you're lucky, I guess hoofing it literally back then, but probably on foot, to get to the ferry dock. And of course, yeah, this is a ferry dock. There's no island yet. You'd have to hop on the ferry or have your own boat to get the island. So people are worried that this would only benefit wealthy folks who had the time and the boats to easily get there and the money to get there. But of course, the aim of Olmsted and the City Beautiful movement was to create a natural paradise in the city that could be enjoyed by factory workers and the wealthy alike. And we've got a quote to that effect from Olmsted here. We want a ground in which people may easily go after their day's work is done, and where they may stroll for an hour, seeing, hearing, and feeling nothing of the bustle and the jar of the streets. And his philosophy was very much for this natural paradise. In fact, when he drew up his plan for Belle Isle, he said that he wanted to keep it kind of as raw as possible. He didn't want, a lot of fancy manicured flower beds and things like that, because, it was felt that natural beauty was more beneficial to sort of, the artifice of gardens and all that. And it was also cheaper. He wanted to keep this affordable for the city. So in his proposal, he said that the city should avoid things like dance houses, racetracks, museums, and collections of zoology and horticulture on the island. And that's pretty much Belle Isle in a nutshell now. So how do things deviate from Olmsted's vision? And well, it began pretty quickly. Here is the 1882 survey of Belle Isle. So this is kind of not quite a blank slate, but this is what Olmsted was working with here. And this was undertaken by a surveyor by the name of Eugene Robinson. It was published out of Boston. So it's very likely that this is the exact concept of the island Olmsted was working with for his process here. In fact, Olmsted only visited Belle Isle once during his planning process, and it was a bit of a disaster. He got there kind of late. He couldn't hop on a ferry. He had to pay a guy to get his rowboat to paddle himself over there. So kind of setting things off on the wrong foot from the get-go. But like I said, this isn't really a blank slate. You can see some roads, some farms, some wetlands, and even a dock. If you look at the what would be the western tip of the island there, it looks almost like a face smoking a pipe there. That's the ferry dock on the edge there. You also notice that this looks completely different shape-wise, the footprint-wise, to what Belle Isle we know today. We'll get to that soon enough. So Olmsted drew up a plan. But he ran into issues with city council. He didn't agree with the way that taxes were being levied to finance the project, and generally had a bad time with it. And he said that that there was a more hesitating and distrustful disposition towards the park undertaking than any other city he had worked with at that point. And handed in his plan and walked away to work on the World's Fair in Chicago, and probably had a great time with that and quickly forgot any of the troubles with Belle Isle. But he did indeed draw up a plan. The city paid him $7 grand, and this is what he drew up. You'll notice some similarities to what we ended up with here. There's a big central avenue. Again, I don't know if my cursor is coming through, but right along there. There's a loop on the western tip, riding trails off to the east, The parade ground, kind of the big feature there, the big well-labeled feature there, are roughly where the athletic fields are now. And landfills are used to build up the island and fill in the lagoons. There's also a covered dock, probably the most substantial structure that he called for along that western tip. There's a beach, and the fishery is still on here. So let's look a little closer here. Let's see some of the, so it does look, it's not totally natural. I mean, we've got, these uniform paths and stuff, but it's not quite what it turned into here, which I think would have shocked Olmsted. So let's do the transition here. Oh, this is where doing the slides in this view isn't going to work. There we go. Hey, look at that. We just move that for the time being. All right. Oh, it's going to come back. I'll hold it down here. So this is the in 1895. This is a view here along Central Avenue. But what's this? Right in the foreground, there's a big flower arrangement. So it's not Olmsted's natural paradise. So again, elements of the plan were carried out. We've got Central Avenue, we've got the Eastern Trail and the Western Loop Canal that came in 1883. And the big parade ground became the athletic field. But walking paths were replaced by driving lanes. Natural planting was replaced by extensive flower beds, and the lagoons and the canals were all dug here. So it's almost like Olmsted provided the skeleton of the plan. And then others who will name soon enough came in and augmented it into the Belle Isle we know today. Let's go to the next one here. All right, so here's the boat livery. Olmsted did suggest a boathouse, and here's the one that was built. And this one, you'll notice, if you got a sharp eye for types of boats, we've got rowboats here. These aren't those canoes that you see in all the slightly later ones. Early on, rowboats were the way people got around, and those kind of fancy canoes with the phonographs and stuff in the back that show up in a lot of other images of the island, like the one we looked at the very start, came a little bit later. It's another great view, one of my favorite early images of the island here. The ferry dock was one of those rare parts of the plan where the final structure was a lot more restrained than Olmsted's concept. He had this big sprawling thing that went along the whole western tip of the island. If you look at the little plume of smoke there from the ferry, the actual ferry dock there is pretty much just a ferry dock there. You also see the first of the bridges to the island here. This particular one was a truss affair, as you can see it, and the decking on it was wooden. When it came time to retar the platforms in, I believe it was 1913, the cart that had the coals that were keeping the tar malleable hit a bump. Some of the coals fell out and the whole bridge burned down. Ended up being replaced with the current one we know. It's always kind of weird when we talk about the Belle Isle Bridge, because it's it was originally just the Belle Isle Bridge, and it got its current name after World War II, when it was named to honor General Douglas MacArthur. So for a long time, I was like, oh, it's the Douglas MacArthur Bridge. That must be from, the 50s or something like that. But the name came later. The bridge itself was built in the 20s. The other thing we can see in this kind of cool aerial view is the boat club. We have a different view of that coming up. So here is a fun old postcard. This is the old skating pavilion near where the present casino is. And you can see how popular this is. There's a more modern skating pavilion there, which is a neat piece of mid-century modern architecture. It's not quite as elaborate, but probably the one if you're on the call today and remember skating on there, that's probably the one you're more familiar with. But there's the the balcony up top where a small orchestra could perform for everybody skating below. So it really kind of looks like a great fun time. Here we've got a view of the first Belle Isle Casino, and I always got to specify this isn't a place for gambling. That's just an old-fashioned word for a gathering place. When they replaced this casino with the current Belle Isle Casino, they actually toyed with the idea of moving this original structure somewhere else, even to the mainland. But of course, that didn't happen. This was kind of an interesting time for architecture in Detroit, because things were changing rapidly with electricity and things like that, that a lot of buildings had shorter shelf lives than ones that were built, slightly earlier, slightly later. And here's the bathing beach here. Got everybody lined up on the dock and the bathhouses back there. Get to that later. The old pavilions are still there and still for rent. This particular one, though, I believe is still, last time I was there, it was still covered in Tyvek and things like that. And I know they've been doing a lot of work on it over the years, because a couple of years back, when I was started with the Detroit Historical Society, which is more than a couple years back now, I remember we got contacted looking for information about what paint color this pavilion was originally painted, because they wanted to match that when they restored it. I don't know if we helped them with that. I didn't know of anything. I still don't know of anything that explicitly spells that out. A lot of the postcards we have that are in color are hand colored, things like that, and the colors will vary pretty wildly from postcard to postcard. Here's one of the Detroit Boat Club buildings. This is, I believe, is the fourth of their locations. They went through a series of buildings. They started on the mainland, moved to Belle Isle, and this particular one actually burned down until they opted for the next one, the fifth, for the concrete design that still stands, and that's the boat club. Of course, when you're coming across the bridge on the immediate left there. And there's the Detroit Boat Club, and then there's the Detroit Yacht Club. The Yacht Club took over a building that was used by the old Michigan Yacht Club. And this particular one, where it's kind of on its own little island, like their current building is about where the beach and the pool and the little water slide and all that are now. Later, they moved to their own island a bit further east of this. And of course, they too went through a series of buildings and started out on the mainland. Detroit, despite Olmsted's wishes, there was also a zoo on the island. And this was the second zoo in Detroit. The first was appropriately enough near Michigan and Trumbull, where the lions and tigers were visible in a much different form decades later. And there's also some kind of interesting structures that are still on the island that a lot of people pass by and don't necessarily give too much thought to. I know I didn't for much of my life. On the right is the White House, or Insel Rua. It was originally the residence of one of the Campo family, and now it's the park offices. It's kind of tucked away. If you're looking for it, it's kind of tucked away next to the back of the aquarium. And those greenhouses that you're always, if you're heading down that road there, the greenhouses that are opposite the aquarium, that's behind those. And on the other side of those is the dairy barn here. The dairy barn, I always just thought it was part of the zoo because it kind of matches the zoo's architecture, at least the zoo as I knew it, the Safari Land Zoo of the 80s. But this was actually a dairy barn. It got a nice restoration job by the oh no, I'm blanking on the name, City Club of Detroit. The original concept was that it was to be a dairy barn. The city would kind of raise cows and raise some extra cash off of the park here. So had we stuck with Olmsted's vision, we wouldn't have so many great examples by important Detroit architects on the island. Albert Kahn is, of course, the biggest name in Detroit architecture, and he gave us the conservatory and the aquarium both early in his career. And the conservatory and the aquarium are actually connected. Last time I was in there, they were working on uncovering the little door that leads between them. That might have actually happened since I don't think I've been there in the last year and a half or so. Kahn also did the Art Deco Livingston Lighthouse, which is the country's only marble lighthouse on the eastern tip of the island. And it's not pictured here, which I guess is in my power. I ought to add it. But he also designed the Reverend Samuel Francis Smith Memorial flagpole over by the athletic field. So kind of outside the usual purview of what you think for Albert Kahn, which I guess a lot of this stuff is if you primarily think of him for industrial architecture and things like that. Interesting thing about the conservatory is the central dome, as it was originally built, was supported by lumber, and that was replaced with the steel beams we have now pretty early in. Van Leyen and Schilling were behind the present casino, which was built in 1908. One of those guys also had some family ties to that Parks and Boulevard committee, so. Not saying anything shady was going on there, but that's a lead I've always wanted to follow and see how that exactly played out there. George Mason did the Detroit Yacht Club, and he's also the man behind the Masonic Temple. And they're both beautiful structures. If you ever can get an excuse to check out the Detroit Yacht Club, it's a fantastic building. Alphinus Chitterdam gave us the Detroit Boat Club, and we would be remiss if we didn't mention that William Knapp designed the Dawson Great Lakes Museum. And he's also the guy behind the Detroit Historical Museum, City Airport, Komyung Airport, the Players Club, and the Scarab Club. So kind of a wide array of buildings. I always thought the Dawson Great Lakes Museum looked like kind of the world's coolest like middle school. And to have that guy also behind, something like the Scarabs Club is kind of wild. All right, I apologize for the way I'm presenting this. We're seeing William Ferguson a little bit earlier than I like to unveil him in the presentation here. So who built the lagoons? A lot of people say they're an Olmsted thing, but as you saw before, he filled in kind of the water features that were there. The route of the Belle Isle canals, as we know them today, goes back to a guy by the name of Michael J.D., who was a Detroit news editor. And he pushed for them as a way to give people a way to get around the island to, you want to be able to leisurely paddle around, but you don't want to be out in the currents with, those early freighters going by. And it can be kind of a bit not relaxing, to say the least. So if there was canals, things that were inland, things that were slower, things that were, kind of protected from all the traffic that was on the river back then, that would be a proper relaxing experience befitting Belle Isle. So in order to realize this, he enlisted a man by the name of William Ferguson, who actually had worked with Olmsted in New York. He's primarily a horticulturalist. I think he had a flower store at one point in Eastern Market, but he also delved into landscaping, and he was appointed superintendent of the island. And here's a quote to that effect about how much influence he exercised in this role as superintendent on shaping the island. So when Mr. Ferguson was appointed superintendent of Belle Isle Park in 1887, he prepared the present comprehensive plan. He turned mosquito breeding grounds into pretty lakes, ran fine drives through what had been wilderness, established flower beds, changing the plants with the seasons. All those things Olmsted would have hated. That's me, not the original quote. So in short, he changed Belle Isle from a wilderness to a place of blossoming beauty. And all this was done so quietly and unostentatiously that many of Belle Isle's thousands of visitors did not know him by sight. But thanks to this, looks like almost like a police composite here, you kind of know him by sight. So that's William Ferguson there, the first park superintendent. But really, the kind of the smart alecky and perhaps truest answer to who built the lagoons are these guys in the background in the photos. they were dug by hand. And this is, you know, the circa 1898 here. This is the era of Pinker's potato patches. Folks are, you know, literally hungry for employment. And there was a lot of labor to that went into doing this. So going back to William Ferguson, of course, as superintendent, he got to live in Solrua in the White House. We've got a view of it here, circa 1900, another postcard view. And I like to think that maybe this kid in the foreground that managed to, you know, imagine that being like the kid that, you know, gets memorialized standing in a photographer's view for a postcard. It's got to be staged, you know. But I like to think that maybe this kid that got this kind of prominent view in this postcard is William Ferguson's son, George. George Ferguson wrote a great memoir about growing up on the island, which his family later donated to the Historical Society, or donated a copy of at least. And, you know, like I said, it was one of the perks of being the park superintendent that you got to live in the White House. So George grew up there, and he writes about kind of all the things you'd want to hear about growing up in Detroit. First of all, in this time period, he talks about shopping at, you know, J.L. Hudson's clothing store in the Detroit Opera House, and then kind of his weird spin on it, which was growing up on this island here. He had a boat that he had to, you know, partially rely on to get around, and partially got to enjoy. There's a quote in that memoir that during the summer months of my life it was almost a continual round of pleasure. I had a good rowboat and a sailboat and a horse to drive. So sounds pretty idyllic, but it wasn't all idyllic. He also talks about going out in his sailboat to try and impress some girls with his sailing prowess, but promptly ended up capsizing in the river. And you know, as cool as it sounds, I don't know, you know, walking uphill to school both ways is a lot, but imagine you having to paddle to school every morning. That's a lot. Little George wasn't the only person in the Detroit River those days. The Detroit River was one of the busiest waterways in the world around the turn of the century. In 1907, in fact, the Detroit River carried more tonnage than the ports of London and New York combined. It wasn't coming into Detroit, it was passing through, but you know, we were you know, an important juncture on goods moving through the Great Lakes. Lots and lots of freighters coming by. And with lots of commerce going on around us, of course, the city itself was also growing. And the island was poised to grow as well. So here we have a chart of the Detroit River and Belle Isle from about 1900 here. And as you can see here, Belle Isle was surrounded by shallows, which made it easy for the island to grow and expand as the 20th century crept forward. On the mainland, buildings were being built, which means a lot of foundations were being dug out. And what do you do with that dirt? Well, as the story goes, if you're the then commissioner of Parks and Boulevards, a guy by the name of Colonel Edward G. Heckle, use it to expand Belle Isle. This is when the Detroit Yacht Club gets its own islands, and when the tips of the island get built out. So as we do the transition here, take a look at those kind of extremities of the island here. So we're jumping from around 1900 here all the way to 1948. Belle Isle now comes to kind of a sharp point on the western tip. The eastern side's a bit more built out there. So here's, you know, the island in 1948 as depicted in this directory map. We've got a list of about 100 attractions on the island here, so 100 things that Olmsted would have hated. But regardless, he kind of laid the groundwork for. The Livingston Lighthouse, the water and surge department's intake, and the sprawling Scott Fountain are all in place now. And the Scott Fountain gets to one of my favorite stories here. James Scott, the namesake of the Scott Fountain, was a very rich but very unliked, hated, unpopular Detroiter. He inherited a lot of his money from his father. He's known for gambling and being kind of a unpleasant guy. There's even a story that he hated kids so much that he built a wall as part of his mansion on Peterborough, specifically to cast a shadow over an adjacent yard where kids played. And as a kid that went to school across from what was left of the Scott Mansion over at Burden School, I can kind of relate to those poor kids that, so they say, he kind of blotted out the sun on their yard. That's one of those stories that sounds kind of too good or too evil to be true. So I don't know if I necessarily buy it, but the fact that this sort of story was circulating about the guy gives you an idea of how people thought about him. When James Scott died, didn't have any heirs. So he willed his money to the city, which seems kind of magnanimous. But he willed it in such a way that it was to be used to build a monument to him. Nobody was really eager to do this. So the folks on the Common Council invested the money. So what started out as a big pot of money to build this monument for Scott turned into an even bigger pot of money. And eventually they came up with an idea. And the idea was this kind of massive fountain complex on the western tip of the island, where there is a statue of James Scott. It's bigger than life size. It's a impressive statue, but given the scope of the grounds, it's kind of dwarfed compared to everything else. One of the things that I always get a kick out of is almost every time I'm visiting the Scott Fountain, there's some kids climbing on the James Scott statue there. So he would have loved that. That's not even to get in what the pigeons are doing to him. So, all right. So here we have a shot from the 1950s. I think we actually narrowed this down to like between like January and March of 1950 here, because of the combination of the weather and what is and isn't on the island here. As you can see, it's really there's some new features here. Down at the bottom center, the old sailing ship, the JT Wing, has been brought in to house the Maritime Museum of the Great Lakes, the forerunner of the Dawson Great Lakes Museum. The JT Wing was the last operating commercial sailing ship on the Great Lakes. It had a really kind of varied career. It was a Sea Scouts training vessel for a time. It underwent some name changes. It was sunk twice, I believe. I think the second time was intentional. They would do that to store boats from time to time. As you keep them wet, they stay preserved. But when you take them out of the water, say you take them out of the water, you put it on a little island, you fill it with artifacts, that hull begins to rot. If you look at images of it, you can kind of see that it looks like its back is broken there. So the structure got essentially condemned, and it had one last job, which they did in kind of a very grandiose way. They turned it into a fire department training scenario, and to do this, they actually fired at the boat with a Tommy gun to ignite it, which feels like a bit. Somebody was I think just taking advantage of their station to be able to do that. We also see the Nancy Brown Peace Carolyn in this view here. Nancy Brown is kind of the anti-James Scott. She was a beloved but very secretive Detroit news advice columnist who hosted an annual prayer service on the island. And of course, we see the Ann Scripps Whitcomb Conservatory with the folk gardens and all that here. And we've got the very small up at the top there, we've got the modern bridge. So these ideas to keep evolving Belle Isle, even though that looks almost like where we're at today, minus the Dawson Great Lakes Museum, folks continue to have kind of grand ideas for the redevelopment of Belle Isle. This is a plan from the 1970s. And this kind of radically reconfigures the island. For one, the beach gets moved to the Canadian side, and the current location where the beach is gets replaced by a marina, which is kind of cool. We've never had a public marina on the island here. There's also a bigger nature center. The area with the conservatory, an aquarium, and the Dawson, gets a restaurant and a concert hall. The casino is gone and replaced with a visitor center closer to the entrance. It kind of makes sense. There's also expanded sports facilities over by the athletic field there. One thing I like is that the good old model yacht basin, despite all the other changes, is still here too. So I like that they found a home for that. This, of course, didn't happen, but that doesn't mean that folks didn't stop dreaming. This is a plan from 2000 that was revised in 2006, and this was actually the plan that the city was operating under until the state took over. The big realized aspect of this plan are the fishing piers that showed up on the island, I believe around 2001 or so. I think that was sort of popped up around the same time as the tricentennial. Got a close-up view of the 2000 plan here, and you can see how kind of grandiose it did get here. This is a detail of that Carolyn in the conservatory area. And you can see that, you know, of course, that's not the JT wing up there. They have a whole new tall ship docked over at the Dawson. They've got a big entrance building for the conservatory grounds. Even looks like the aquarium itself is almost double the size there. Would have been great if it did transpire, but of course it was not to be. One of the more out there plans is this one. This is a redevelopment plan from 2012. And this, of course, was when the city was in its hour of need budgetarily. And a developer came up with this plan to turn Belle Isle into almost like it's like a Hong Kong like sovereign island off the shore. I don't know how that would work international law wise, and I don't know how that would work foundation wise, because this kind of a fancy hotel complex, I think that the water table is usually I would say about a foot under surface level there, but I think it's a lot higher these days. You know, these days you need a park pass to get on the island, but if you need this, you'd have to have your passport, presumably. So, but you know, hey, I guess you can't fault somebody for thinking big, as wild as that is. And folks have been thinking big for a good long time, like literally big. Really dramatic plans aren't a new thing. For the city's bicentenary in 1901, it was proposed that a 200-foot tall column would be put as on the west side of the island, kind of in that space where they later built to build the Scott Fountain. It would have been surrounded by this very classical colonnade, and it kind of, in a weird way, invokes Olmsted's old dock complex that ran across that whole tip there. The weird thing is, if this thing looks familiar, it's because it was actually built, but it wasn't built in Detroit. This is another one of those postcards of things and buildings that you know, they had a great image on that they slapped on a postcard, but didn't actually transpire. The real one is in Put-in Bay, and that's the Perry's Victory Monument down there. So another thing that Ohio ended up with that was almost in Detroit, just like Toledo there. Now, of course, things weren't always, Belle Isle saw its share of turmoil into the 20th century as well. During World War II, the military used the island to practice amphibious assault drills. So kind of echoes of Omaha Beach off of the Belle Isle beach there. During World War II, one of the most notorious incidents to happen on Belle Isle occurred in 1943. The weather was hot. Detroit's population was outgrowing the availability of housing, with all the folks coming in for the wartime labor, arsenal democracy. And folks did what they always did on hot days. They escaped to Belle Isle. It was common to sleep out on Belle Isle even when it was really hot. The tensions of the time, though, proved inescapable. and the 1943 race riot broke out, beginning on the island. Rumors spread that depending on who you asked, an African-American woman was tossed off the bridge by a white mob, or a white woman was tossed off the bridge by an African-American mob. Neither happened, but that didn't stop the fighting from spilling off the island and onto the mainland, like we see here with this image of a man getting ganked off of a streetcar. After the violence, the Detroit police began training on the island. We've got a view of a phalanx here afterwards. Jumping forward a bit to 1967, probably not where you're thinking I'm going. There was the Love-In riot on Belle Isle. The incident that no one remembers, or as they say, if you do, you weren't really there, I guess. WABX and things like that. The radio station used to host like kite flies and love-ins and stuff on the island. And that summer, there was a love-in on the island. There was the bands played, I think like SRC and the Frost were there. The partying also attracted a local biker gang who happened to get into it with the kind of hippie contingent of the folks there. And the police made the decision to essentially kettle the situation. They shut down the Belle Isle Bridge. So folks were trapped on the island. We've got, folks kind of escaping onto the roof there. Now moving a bit later that summer, during the more widely known 1967 riot or rebellion or uprising, a month later, Detroit's old bathhouse was used as a makeshift jail to hold the people who were getting rounded up. It was because of all the arrests, people were getting detained in buses or in garages and things like that. So one of the spots that they activated to do this was the Belle Isle bathhouse. And not too long after, the bathhouse was actually demolished. I don't know if that kind of association fed into that, or if it was an old building at that point. Might have been sort of the same thinking that went into that. But a lot of the people who were around during that area, the bathhouse was associated with being used as this kind of makeshift jail. But by and large, the good days outnumber the bad on Belle Isle. And this, to kind of pay off on something I mentioned at the outstart here, is that view if those women on the bridge in the first slide had turned around of the band shell, on the river there. I don't know, are we able to take questions? Is that?
Oh yeah, I just had to unmute myself. Sure.
Okay.
There's a couple of things in the chat here.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Let me see.
Yeah, somebody says, where did the tufa rock come from in the conservatory?
That's a really good question. I actually don't know.
That's why they asked it to show off.
That's I'm glad.
And somebody mentions the Battle of the Bridge. I think that was with the race riot of 1943.
I believe so, yes.
Can you maybe give us a little more detail about that?
Oh, sorry. Well, the fighting traveled along the bridge onto the mainland. There was, geez, off the top of my head, I feel horrible. Like there was a number of fatalities and a good number of fires and things like that. I don't have the number on the top of my head. And I hate to hazard a guess right now, but it was, yeah, pretty ugly incident there.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any other questions. Does anybody have any questions?
Did you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I'm
okay. Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Okay, Jaman, I'm happy. I guess this is always kind of the built-in thing, and I'm interested. It's always like when this comes up, it's an interesting thing. The Ile de Cocan there. One of the stories about Belle Isle has to do with its name, and the story that I was brought up with, and a lot of other folks I'm sure heard, was that the island was originally known as Snake Island, and that when the French came along, they brought in pigs to stomp out the snakes. That's the Ile de Cocan. I believe that's the island of the pigs. I've been trying to figure out the story, the kind of origin of that. I think as best as I can tell, and Jaman, you might be well ahead of me on this, it is that it seems to show up in the 1800s. And I'm not sure if it was kind of I've kind of under the belief it was a bit of a fanciful story, but it is one of those ones that's kind of been in the popular imagination, and it's almost built into this that this comes up every Q&A session. So I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah, you were right earlier when
Okay.
you stated that it was Swan Island, Wannabeezy.
There we
So it
go.
was Swan Island, but there is this legend that the French brought pigs onto the island to eat up the snakes, and that's really not true. It's just a myth. I grew up learning the same thing. I heard the same thing, but in reality, what it was, the French did store pigs on the island.
Yes.
And those pigs did eat the native snakes, but they didn't put the pigs on the island to eat the native snakes. It's just that pigs eat everything, and so they did name it Hog Island or Pig Island, or as you stated with the French pronunciation, which I can't do, but Ile au Cochon, which is of course Hog Island or Pig Island. So Louis de Quindère would be the person who established it as a place to store pigs, and he gave it that French name, which it would have for a while, until the Campo family renamed it Belle Isle.
Yes, thank you. And this, I guess, to run on this, the story I've heard about Belle Isle, and it seems like Belle Isle, I always just thought, it's French beautiful. That it was there's a story that it was named to honor Louis Cass's daughter Isabella. And that's another one of those ones where it seems like it might be one of those sort of myths or something like that. It's a weird jump, but yeah, thank you so much for helping out. It's an honor to have you here. So.
Jordan. Let's see. There is a little bit more stuff in the.
Oh yeah. Okay, so interesting one. The water table. I'm no architect, but I do know that when we built when we did some renovations over at the Dawson Great Lakes Museum, we built that new little lagoon or inlet there. That was a whole back and forth because just during the planning of that, the water levels on the island were really changing. As I'm sure a lot of you remember in I think it was 2019, how the Carolyn was almost an island surrounded by water there. So that's the kind of pretty dramatically, you can see the differences there. The willow trees along the edge of the conservatory grounds were sticking out of the water for a while. So, ooh, let's see, where was the spirit tree on the island? That I'm actually not familiar with that one. That's kind of the thing I love about doing this is everybody brings something new. If is that Carol, if you wanted to.
Oh yeah, I had heard there was an African American spirit tree
Really?
African American families came on the island and they would sit around the spirit tree, but no one knows where it was.
That I'm interested in. Yeah. Yeah, you've given me something to do some research on here. Yeah, I'm sorry I don't have any details there, but you've tapped into something that's a good mystery here. Let's see. Yes, the Great Bear, the People of the Three Fires origin story. I hate to butcher it, but the telling I remember is that the island was like the back of a sleeping bear, I believe. Let's see if I scroll past anything. Thank you for all the kind words, folks that chimed in with those. Anything else? Oh, here we go. Oh, wow. All right. Yeah, these Drew has a very interesting comment here about sort of race relations and integrated spaces or spaces of kind of racist incidents on the island here. I'm honestly not familiar with the canoe incident. That sounds like it's a definitely worth researching, though. And I'm you know, like so many things, that seems like it should have a larger footprint in history, and like to bring that to life, bring that to light in my talk if I can. As far as the athletic competitions and things like that, I've heard too, yeah, that they were integrated. I don't know how those would occur in practice. We do have some newsreel footage of from the 20s of a kind of children's day, and you can see that the crowds in that are integrated, which is kind of fantastic for just footage from the 20s. You know, the folks they were pointing the cameras at weren't always representative of the folks who were actually out there. That's not up on our website yet, but that's one of the ones that will be uploaded soon. And the conflicts with the lifeguards, that's another one I am interested in reading about. I'm just going to copy and paste this so I can do some research, and I can even drop my email in the chat here. I can follow up with some of these too. Fantastic questions. These are honestly probably this is the best Q&A I've ever had. And I feel like it's the least answers I've had, but this is a really cool engaged crowd here. Anybody else? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brendan, for presenting on this, because we all love Belle Isle. It's great to hear all these stories about it.
One of my favorite spots. So and with the DPL being one of my other favorite spots in the city, so this is great to be able to do.
Sure, come visit us in person sometime.
I will. It's been a minute since I've been in there. So,
And Brendan, I can see you're a gentleman and a scholar.
well, thank you. Thank you. I try to live up to both of those. So.
All right. Okay, great. Does
Question
anybody?
came from the chat here.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
When will we be able to get the recording? Well, it's gonna take a few weeks, but then we're gonna post it on our Detroit Public Library. I think we have a YouTube channel. Oh, yeah.
Cool.
That's what we do. Okay, if there's nothing else, I just want to thank everybody for attending, and thank you, Brendan, and everybody have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Then you hit the end button.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank
yeah.
you.
Okay, good. Okay, good night, everybody.